Alright, good morning. This is nominative, accusative, and the first three declensions review. This is everything that will be on the stage 3 test as far as grammar is concerned. So in about 5 minutes we're going to go over 3 things that you really need to know, not just for the test but for Latin in general. So I'm going to shut up and keep going. Alright, we're going to start off with a couple questions, 2 things that we're trying to figure out. The first one is, what is a case? This word case is very important, so if you don't know what it is, write it down in your notes, and we're going to define it later. Then we're going to figure out, once we figure out what a case is, we're going to figure out which ones we know. And the second question is, what is a declension? Once again, declension, good word to write down if you don't know it, to define later, and then we're going to figure out which one of those we know. So we're going to start out with case. To understand what a case is, first you need to understand what parts of a sentence are. We're going to keep it very basic. There are a lot of different parts to sentences, and we are going to start off by looking at what a verb is. To keep it simple, the verb is an action within the sentence, if it's an action verb. On a side note, and not as important, and if this confuses you, just ignore this, there are things called linking verbs like is or feels that only serves to rename or describe the subject. So, if you don't know, if this is confusing to you right now, don't worry about it too much. All you need to know is that the verb is the action in the sentence. Then you have subjects, which we will also know as the nominative case in Latin. Subjects in a sentence, they're simply the things doing the action. On a side note, in the case of linking verbs, the subject is the thing being described or renamed. But all you need to remember is that the subject is doing the action. And lastly, you have direct objects, which in Latin, we'll see it as the accusative case. The direct object in a sentence, very simply, is the thing that is receiving the action. Once again, side note about linking verbs, they don't have direct objects as there is no action. So, to review, verb is the action, subjects do the action, and direct objects receive the action. So let's look at some examples. It says, identify the subjects, direct objects, and verb in each sentence. What similarities do you see? What differences? Can you figure out the different nominative and accusative endings? First question, identifying the subjects, direct objects, and verbs in each sentence. Remember that subjects do the action, direct objects receive the action, and verbs are the action itself in a sentence. I'm going to let you pause the video and go over these. You can copy these Latin sentences down and identify for yourself on your own sheet of paper. When you're done, keep playing the video. Alright, the first sentence, filius ancillam salutat, means the son greets the slave girl. First you have to ask yourself, and you can use this English sentence to start you off, who's doing the action in the sentence? That would be the son. What is the action that he's doing? He is greeting, and who is he greeting? The slave girl. Notice how in English we make this it's pretty straightforward just based on the order. Start off with the subject, then we have the verb, then we have the object. But not all languages do this. In Latin, definitely doesn't do it. Because in Latin, the ending doesn't matter. Or the word order doesn't matter. So, in this sense, we have filius ancillam salutat, which means the son greets the slave girl. Notice that the son, filius, that's the US ending. We have ancillam, slave girl, and greets. So we have the the subject, the direct object, and the verb. Down here, notice how when we flip the sentence in English, the slave girl greets the son, and we have ancilla, filium, salutat. Notice the difference here. When the son up here was the subject, it was filius. But now that he's the direct object, it is filium, and vice versa. Slave girl up here, when she was direct object, was ancillam, and down here, she is ancilla. So you can figure out now that when something is in Latin, when something is a subject, it has a different ending from when it is a direct object. Now what those specific endings are, we're going to get to in a second, but what you can notice is a similarity between the direct objects in these sentences. Notice how ancillam and filium, if it ends in M, it's probably a direct object. And direct objects receive the action. In both of these sentences, the son is the one being greeted, and up here, the slave girl is the one being greeted. Down here we have further further examples that basically illustrate the same thing with slightly different endings. We have canis matrum consumit. The dog eats the mother. The mother is the one being consumed. Notice how her name ends in M now. And canis has an IS ending. Down here, we have mater canem consumit, when the mother gets revenge and turns around and eats the dog. Notice how that IS turns into an EM, and how this EM on the end of matrum turns into an ER. Alright, so now that we've gone over direct objects and subjects, and we've talked about these different endings and whatnot, we're going to have to move on to some other questions, but I just want to review one more time that since Filius is the subject here, it's going to be in what's called the nominative case. That US ending is the nominative case for Filius. Down here, ancilla is the subject, so it is in the nominative case, but for ancilla, the nominative case ending is A. Canis is the subject, so it will be in the nominative case. It has an IS ending, and mater is in the nominative case, and it has an ER ending. All the nominative cases in these sentences have different endings. Latin shares a lot of them, but what you can tell for sure is when you look at the direct objects or the accusative case, even though there's a different letter before each one, an AM, a UM, an EM, and another EM, they always end in M. So you can use that kind of as your guide. So, nominative, subject, accusative, direct object. Now that we figured that out, that is the answer to question 1, what a case is and which ones do we know. Well, we know the nominative and the accusative, and the case is how you show what part of a sentence a Latin noun is. There are a couple more questions. These are all about the nominative endings themselves. From the last page, you can kind of see we saw US and AM and EM and all those different ones. So what we're going to look at now is what are the nominative endings for the first declension, what about the second, and what about the third. So we're going to start moving on to talking about declensions. And declensions are families of a pattern of endings that nouns tend to follow. And well, that'll make a little bit more sense in a minute. So we're going to move on. So the answers. All right, so you noticed in that last that sentence a little while ago, we had ancilla turned into ancillam. That noun would be what we call a first declension noun because it follows this pattern. When it's nominative, it has an A ending. When it is accusative, it has an AM ending. That means it is a first declension noun. Declensions don't change meaning. It's just how you recognize a pattern. And typically, nouns don't change declensions. So ancilla is first declension, and it will always be first declension. Second declension, Filius. Notice in the nominative has a US. Over here it says it can also be R, which it can, but for right now, if that's confusing to you, don't worry about it. And in the accusative, when it is accusative, when it's a direct object, it has a UM ending. If you notice that those bottom two sentences, we had you didn't see that many similarities between all those, between canis and mater when it was nominative, and that's because the third declension doesn't have one or two set endings that can be nominative. It can be any of them. It can be an X, it can be an R, it can be an IS. There's a bunch. So we can't really go on that, but what we can really do to see that something is third declension is that the accusative ending is always EM. Alright, so on this sheet, same examples one more time. I want you to go through here and label the nouns for their declension. You're going to want to pause the video right here because I'm about to go to the next slide with the answers. Alright, here you go. As you can see, Filius has the US ending, so it's second declension, and ancillam has the AM ending. That puts it in the first declension. Down here has ancilla. Even though the ending's changed, it's still in that pattern of the first declension. Filium has the UM, and so since it's not a US, but it turns into a UM, that's still second declension. Like I said, nouns don't change declension. And down here we have all of our third declension nouns. Canis, and canem, and matrum, and mater, they're all third declension. So, to wrap up, the two questions we started out with, number one, what is a case and which ones do we know? Well, the case describes the part of a sentence that the noun is acting as. For example, subjects are nominative, direct objects are accusative. And this is shown in Latin by using different endings. And a declension is it's a noun's family. There are patterns of case endings that a noun follows. There are 5, but we only know the first 3, and words don't change declension typically. If you need to go back and review any part of this, please do. And if there's something about this video that is unclear, please let me know. Best of luck, and Godspeed.